Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams for our discussion on race matters. Today we are honored to have with us in conversation Professor Cornel West, coming to us from Princeton, and Dr. Suraj Yengde, coming to us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor West is Professor of the Practice of Public Philosophy at Harvard University and Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. Philosopher, activist, and author of 20 books and 13 edited volumes, Professor West is one of America's preeminent public intellectuals. And I would like to add here that to his expansive scholarship, he brings warmth and exuberance and the fullness of life, whether it is with colleagues and students or with people he greets and talks to on the street. Dr. Suraj Yengde is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, an award-winning scholar and activist. His best-selling book, Caste Matters, went into reprint within a week of its publication. An attorney and PhD by qualification, Suraj has worked in international human rights law in Geneva, London, and New York. He is a co-convener of the Dalit Black Lives Matter Symposium and Dalit and Black Power movement. This session is in collaboration with Dialogics, an online discussion forum run by Suraj. He has spoken for us at BIC earlier, and we are very pleased to have him back. Thank you both for being here. In the run-up to this evening, we spoke to a few of our BIC members, and there were some questions that we will pose to Professor West at the end of the conversation. So let me begin with some context. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois opens The Souls of Black Folk with the famous line written in 1903, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." In your book, Race Matters in 1993, Dr. West, you say the problem of the 21st century remains the problem of the color line, and recent events would seem to confirm this. You wrote Race Matters in the wake of the Rodney King beating and uprising in Los Angeles. That video was the first in a long line of videos of police brutality on African Americans, as we have seen in recent weeks, with the killing of George Floyd, among others. This, of course, forces us to ask, has anything changed in the last 28 years since the first edition of your book? And yet, in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And Professor West, you have asked us, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. About 20 years ago, Professor West, we were both part of a walk that traced the history of the Middle Passage and slavery in the Americas. Today, help us to understand that past, whose legacy in Jim Crow laws and lynchings persists in the systemic racism and violence that Black people experience in the justice system and nearly every aspect of American life. What, if anything, has changed, and what might be the way forward? I will hand the floor over to Suraj now to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Prateeti. After that very soulful introduction and the introductory comments, I have to a little bit gather myself. But as outset, also let me thank Ravi, Raghu, and Lekha. I imagine it's 12:30 midnight in India, and you all are awake for this. We appreciate you. Welcome, Professor West. It's good to see you. We couldn't see each other during this semester because of the pandemic.
Exactly.
But we are very excited to convene this conversation, and it's also a very terrible time that we have to come and talk about our pains, and whenever there is an inflicting of atrocity on our people. And it almost has become a template to convene to grief in publicly, and the public grief is something the oppressor world almost kind of fetishizes of the oppressed. So to begin with, there has always been a conversation about the color line that Prateeti mentioned, taking very much from Du Bois. But in contemporary times, we see that color line has become a person of color line. There is a certain individuality and a certain rainbow added to that. Would you help us understand the Black struggle that we have in America right now, Black and brown struggle, with other multiple colors? Because you have been very vocal about how the multiracial struggle this is. The young folks and people from various kinds of orientation, various shades are there on the field. How do you look at this?
Well, let me first say I'm just blessed to be in conversation once again with you, my dear brother. It's been now 3.5 wonderful years of brotherhood, comradeship, dinners, talks, protests, street activity, intellectual dialogue. I want to salute my dear sister, Prateeti, for her very, very kind and generous remarks. And I do remember marching with her 20 years ago. And I just so glad that we're able to not just come together, but to be and to stay together. Black, Dalit, Dalit, Black. When Du Bois talked about the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, he understood the connection between the local and the global. Because he goes on to say it's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in Latin America, it's in the Caribbean and the USA. And what I've tried to do is to build on what I understand to be the best of the Du Bois legacy, which is always to begin with empire and the legacies of various colonial regimes, the legacy of various imperial projects around the world, and the fact that at the end of the 20th century that he was talking about, you still had the American empire, you still had the Russian empire, and you had the Chinese empire still at work, and as the three dominant empires in the world. And so anytime you're talking about race, racism, or white supremacy, or Brahmin supremacy, that you're always talking about both a predatory capitalism operating, connected with, situated within it, is in fact a Brahmin supremacy or white supremacy wherever you're looking in various parts of the globe. And then the crucial issue of patriarchy that's always already operating as well. And so what I think we are witnessing right now is a marvelous global awakening, because it's not just in Minneapolis, it's not just in the cities in the US empire, but it's all around the world, all around the world. I mean, now it's true, I mean, it's 22,000 cities and towns in the United States. That's a lot of sites and places, but it has now spilled over in a magnificent way. And what I'm hoping is that, let's say in the States, we can make the connection between police power and police murder, between Wall Street power and Wall Street criminality, between Pentagon power and Pentagon murder as well. The drones that are being dropped all around the world began under Bush, 45, 542 under Obama, and now we're hundreds and counting under Trump. It could be in Yemen, it could be in Pakistan, it could be in Afghanistan. And then the connection between the kinds of xenophobic, authoritarian, neo-fascist policies of leaders in India, in Brazil, in the United States, in Rwanda, in Hungary, so that we understand that we are in a solidaristic movement that is global, of people who are being dominated, subjugated, demeaned, degraded. And now that the focus is on Black Lives Matter, I just want to make sure that Black Lives Matter is in no way a parochial, local, or provincial movement, but a movement in the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and W.B. Du Bois and Ella Baker and Victoria Garvin. It has this larger connection with struggles all around the world. It could be with our Roma brothers and sisters in Europe. It could be with our Dalit brothers and sisters. That's one of the things we will be talking about even in more detail. And I'll be listening to you because I learned so much from you, my brother. You know that. And the honor of writing the introduction to your powerful magisterial text, Caste Matters, was one of the great blessings of my life, really. But we want to talk about our Palestinian brothers and sisters under Israeli occupation. We want to talk about Tibet. We want to talk about Kashmir. We want to talk about even Jews catching hell in France, or being killed in Pittsburgh. That as a Christian, I believe in being morally consistent and having a spiritual substance that gives a primacy to the moral and the spiritual, but always intricately connected to an analysis of power in imperial structures of domination, capitalist structures of domination, patriarchal structures of domination, white supremacist structures of domination, Brahmin supremacist structures of domination, and so on. So that for me is the framework. And it's very important right now that the Black Lives Matter movement always make these kinds of local, global connections in order to be true to the best of our tradition.
No, I mean, I think this is a very important entry to kind of frame the Black as a center, but also to kind of think about the potential and possibilities of its global connection, because we could immediately see the love for the Black people the world has, at least with the kind of protest we have seen in America and also in India. I mean, in India, the Dalit community, for example, were on streets protesting for the Black lives, and they almost were trying to uplift about 130-year-old connections that were kind of forced, even though they were so much of a distant boundaries. And right now, it's in a way blessing of information technology that we kind of know immediately what is happening. But let me quickly bring back to you to the United States and to talk through a neoliberal framework, because with your synopsis of power, you have equated that to violence, which is the murder and power of any thought, and how capital as a machine operates very much invisibilized through its sort of fangs of this institution's military and so forth. In American context, for example, the Indian American community in this case is when compared to the ethnic minority, makes the most, the median income is the highest. They make six figures, $110,000 to $20,000 per year, which is more than twice of an average income of of American. And let me not even include Black and brown and refugees and immigrant folks, and they are catching hell. So now when we frame a dialogue, and I understand there is a history, but within the person of color, I was reading an article which was critical of granting this passage very much a diversity and inclusion type of framework, where a person of color gets an upper hand, but they don't have a history of an enslavement of the people like you. Your blood, your descendant has a certain history to this land and to the power structure that America has built upon. But also there are some people who kind of benefit out of it, if you will. So how open are we to get this person of color going on within the broader struggle, especially keeping attention to this kind of tendencies of class structures that we operate in?
I appreciate the question. Well, one is that on the one hand, since 1965 and the dismantling of the white supremacist immigration laws of 1924, it opened the door to a variety of peoples all around the world, as opposed to simply those from Europe, and especially those from certain parts of Europe, of England and Scotland and so forth. Now, once you got that opening, then you got a wave of new immigrants from Africa, from Asia, from the Caribbean, even more so. And that provided a very different immigrant population. And so you had precious brothers and sisters from Asia and from Africa who had been excluded before. Now, many of those who did arrive were already themselves either skilled or themselves distant from the impoverished masses in their own country.
Mm-hmm.
So they arrived in a country, in an empire, the United States, that has its own impoverished masses.
That's right.
Numerically more white than anything, but
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately Black and brown and indigenous peoples. And so those immigrants, like any other voluntary immigrants, hit the ground running. Even when they are deprived of certain resources, they come with certain attitudes, certain self-confidence, certain self-image of self-respect, and are able to seize opportunities in the U.S. empire. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I'm not against that at all. But it means then that you're going to have, professionals, those who are getting access to professional status, who are from India, who are from Korea, who are from China, who are from Japan, and who are from Jamaica, who are from a variety of different places. And yet you still have the racial hierarchy in the United States in place, embedded within its predatory capitalism and connected to the empirical tentacles. The military, for example, is 40% Black and brown. When Trump talked about turning the military against the U.S. people, he's got 40% of Black and brown in that army. And whether they're going to turn on their mothers and fathers in Washington, D.C., as we saw a couple of weeks ago, is an open question. That's why some of us were calling for principled disobedience and principled defiance of the military orders if Trump were to turn the guns against the protesters. And that's a serious issue, but it's crucial because it has to do with the fact that the new immigrants themselves who have been here since 65, let's say, and some even later, now situated in a history that they themselves have to come to terms with. So even when they benefit from it, they're still benefiting from a system that was founded on somebody else's land, indigenous peoples, genocidal attacks founded on African slave labor for over nearly 100 years under the U.S. Constitution, 1789 to 1865, and then opened up into the 19th century and the 20th century, these various opportunities. So that, I think, is something that has to be taken into consideration when we talk about dialogues between those of us who have been here 10 generations, those of us whose great-grandmothers and grandfathers and great-greats and great-great-greats and great-great-great-greats were enslaved and then emerged out of slavery, 12 years, multiracial democracy, Reconstruction, dismantling of Reconstruction, and the neo-slavery called Jim Crow and Jane Crow and American terrorism sets in. And it would be another 100 years until 1965 that the masses of Black people were even able to vote, whereas the new immigrants can arrive, get their citizenship status, and vote immediately. So those histories have to be taken into consideration. Now, in terms of the wonderful solidarity that we see around the world, that's got two sides of it too. One side is marvelous moral and spiritual sensitivity to the suffering and misery of Black people. And that's a genuine solidarity with Black folk. We see Dalit brothers and sisters in India, progressive Brahmins in India, Africans of all sorts from Mali all the way to South Africa. We saw it in London and Paris. We saw it in Guatemala. We saw it in Chile. But the flip side of that is, you see, is that the U.S. empire commands such a central stage in terms of the corporate media that there is a soft power hegemony of what goes on in the United States all around the world.
That's right.
All around the world. Hip hop is one expression of it in terms of the lingua franca of young people, be they Dalit, Haitian, Guatemalan, Brazilian, or New York. So that it's the cultural hegemony of the empire and the centering of the activities in the empire by corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, so forth and so on, that commands a certain attention of people regarding what's going on with Black folk in the Black Lives Matter movement. What the challenge is reciprocity, mutuality, you see. Where is the U.S. solidarity with those who are suffering in India?
That's right.
You see what I mean? Where is the U.S. solidarity with those who are suffering on the West Bank in Palestine? Where is the U.S. suffering with those who are suffering in Paris, in London, in Guatemala, and so forth? The funeral that we saw, our precious brother George Perry Floyd Jr., you know, it's a magnificent moment of spirituality, overflowing love, not one mention of hatred and revenge to anybody.
Absolutely.
At that funeral, you know, unbelievable. But the same funerals take place with Dalit brothers and sisters every day in India. The same kinds of tears that flow in the West Bank, in Palestine, the same kind of tears that flow with Jews who have been attacked in France, the same kind of tears that flow with folk who are suffering in Ethiopia, in Mali. So that the centering of and the center staging of Black Lives Matter, often rendered invisible in the United States, but now put on the international stage, is a beautiful thing in terms of the solidaristic response. But there's got to be a reciprocal response, and that's what we don't see. You see, that's part of the need to globalize our consciousness and to recognize crying those tears in Houston, Texas, has to be connected to the tears that are shed in various other parts of the world of oppressed peoples. And yet the Dalit plight, the Dalit predicament does not yet command the kind of spotlight that it should, that the Black Lives Movement can command, in part because it's in the US empire and the corporate media zeroes in on it and people respond all around the world. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, these Dalit brothers and sisters are just as precious as Brother Floyd.
You know, I think when you were saying that, I was simultaneously thinking about on the question of reciprocity. You know, and it's a very important a value of a human moral that one has to, you know, carry. And I think I'll come back to it very soon. But to kind of bring back to the American experience of American dream, what Malcolm X called an American nightmare, and it continues to repeat, especially for poor people of various colors, but most importantly, it tackles the complicated idea of discrimination through racism, which is very much normalized in society. And in contemporary times, whenever we see each structure of American empire is built on the foundation of atrocities committed on Black and brown people. And the foundations that are raised, the huge towers that are raised, and then it is, of course, exported to the rest of the world as if it's an American marvel, a new invention, a creation. And then we have iPhones and new kind of technologies, literally praising and taking our own credit to say America is a dream that captures you know, wild imaginations. But then we again see how this dream is distorted and how very few people come to terms with it. And then that is then easily transported in various institutions, which becomes a structural part of racism. And then, you know, people then kind of individualize or normalize this. Looking through the vantage point, not only of dear brother departed George Floyd, but also other lives that have been lost, be it the trans people. We have seen a big rally this past week, you know, Black Trans Lives Matter movement in Brooklyn. And you know, and then we have the sexual minorities and religious minorities. There is something that has to do centering around the hatred of this Black body. Where do you think this hatred comes from? Because someone has to really hate someone so much to inflict such a repeated form of harm. If I'm angry on you, I will try to beat you once or get angry for some time. But this is a sustaining anger. And I wonder what that anger is that sustains American fuel of hatred of others.
Yeah, that's a profound question, though, brother. It really is. On a general level, it's a human affair. It's very hard to find any society, let alone any empire, that is not inhabited by human beings who emerge out of their mother's wombs or by cesarean section in their stomachs, who come to a consciousness of knowing that their bodies will undergo extinction one day and will be the culinary delight of worms. That generates insecurity, fear, and anxiety. And what one does with those fears and insecurities and anxieties in light of the social structures in place, the institutions in place, and the cultures that are already in place when one emerges from the womb. And usually the institutions and structures try to provide various ways of channeling those fears and anxieties and insecurities through trying to convince people that they are better than somebody else. Skin color could be one. We know gender is a fundamental way in which men are convinced they're better than women. Certain regions have regional identities. They're better than these people in these regional identities. There's so many different markers that provide some sense of security and safety of an ego, given the fact that we know that we're going to die soon, given the fact that we feel as if we can feel better about ourselves by ascribing some superior status to somebody's inferior status. Now, racism when it comes to skin color, or white supremacy when it comes to skin pigmentation, became the fundamental marker in early modern Europe that was rooted in a predatory capitalist system that could sell bodies based on their skin pigmentation, make huge profits on the selling of those bodies, as long as those bodies are stigmatized, marked as inferior, signs of degradation, signs of being demeaned. And once that history underwent accumulation over time and space, then people just learned how to hate. They learned how to express contempt to certain kinds of peoples, you see. And I mean, you continue to teach me much, of course, when it comes to caste, which cuts so deep in terms of a hatred and a contempt of a human being who is cast as untouchable and unseeable and unapproachable and so forth, with the various hierarchies to provide some ego security for human beings who know they're in the process of being on their way to death, and they need some structure of value to ascribe to themselves before they actually die, to feel good about themselves before the worms actually get them. And that's at a very general level. Once you dip that general story into any historical moment in the past and present of our species, you find structures of domination. You find structures of degradation that we have to resist. And we have various traditions in the species, moral, spiritual, religious, that say there is a sanctity, there is a dignity, there is a preciousness and a pricelessness to human beings that's not reducible to any of these markers we're talking about. Skin color, gender, whatever marker it is, sexual orientation, whatever marker we've come up with, those markers are penultimate and are subordinate to the ultimate value of human beings in all of their dignity. And that's the source of the resistance and the critique of these structures of degradation, structures of domination that have been much of the history of the species. And right now, we're in a moment where, especially in the younger generation, where the anti-racism is higher now than it's ever been in the history of the modern world. We've never had so many young folk who are committed to the value of people of color in a moral way. But I tell you, the sad feature of our time is that it's unclear whether the American empire can reform itself. That the greed at the top is so entrenched, not just on Wall Street and all of its crimes of insider trading and market manipulation and predatory lending and fraudulent activities, and the way in which our politicians in the neo-fascist wing of the ruling class, which is Trump and company, or the neoliberal wing of the ruling class, which is Biden and Obama and Pelosi, they are so entrenched that there's a rigidity there. There's a difficulty of seeing possibilities of fundamental change in the system. And if that is the case, then we really got to look internationally. We got to look for international pressure. That's why Martin King and Malcolm X planned to get together in June of 1964, as you know, and go to the United Nations and bring United States, put the United States on trial for the violation of human rights of Black people. Because internally, the American empire was running out of its democratic gas.
That's right.
Just the tank's more and more empty. And therefore, the fascists are stronger than the serious radical Democrats, not the neoliberals, but the radical Democrats. You see. And we know the history of the United States in terms of using its repressive apparatus to assassinate, murder, keep under surveillance, co-opt, domesticate the radical voices. And of course, you get the same thing in India with the authoritarians and the neo-fascists and the ugly uses of the repressive apparatus. And we won't even, and that's before you even get to Kashmir, where it's just massive repressive responses to people's struggles there. So that we're at a moment now where on the one hand, this marvelous manifestation of an awakening, but on the other hand, the rigidity of an imperial system, the rigidity of white supremacist practices on the ground with police. So you can't send policemen to jail if they continually go to a jury. It only takes one vote in the jury to let the policeman off. But if your fellow citizens themselves are deeply racist and worship the police never go to jail. That's been the history in the last 50 years. So it's not just the police, it's the court system, it's the prosecutors, it's the jury, it's the judges, and so on. So what does one do in such a system when your own, fathers and sisters and mothers and kids are being shot down, and the folk who are shot down never go to jail? Well, it's going to spill over.
I think so. I think, the American culture is very much worshipping violence. And there is always this fascination around protection. And there is a very male-dom character who is muscular. And there is a very militarized attire that continues to animate a younger or popular imagination. And I think America kind of frames itself. But looking at American history itself, this is not new. And we all know it is not new because it's a repeated episode. And whenever lives are lost, the ruling class gives a little bit breadcrumbs for us to silence our angst. And then, it repeats. We see since the advent of movement of Marcus Garvey, Du Bois, and then, the whole earliest, first half of the 20th century, civil rights movement. And then we, of course, saw what has happened. And you wrote your classic Race Matters on the issues that were taking place in the late 20th century. And then we see this now. And there was also, if you look at 1970s just onwards, there have been white people or people with whatever relevant numbers, they were present there. But also there was an alternative gimmick that was working around to kind of undersail the struggle. But now you see within the 2020 space, Black Lives Matter is facing a big challenge of all lives matter. And then this all lives matter, we understand the very complicity of this idea of how undermining of or Black pain or the oppression of this is taking place. How do you think all lives matter, that was always a phenomena of American Constitution, works out with its constitutional framework to literally do the same thing, to not give respect or attention to Black Lives Matter. So it's almost a proxy to use a broader framework. And I ask this for our audience to also understand how does one encounter this, because right now we are seeing that head-on fights between all lives and Black lives.
But see, I draw a distinction between cheap universalism and genuine universalism. I believe in universality. I believe in internationalism. I believe in a humanist tradition that keeps track of the humanity of each and every one of us as a Christian. Human beings being made in the image and likeness of God. But the cheap universalism is a claim about all lives matter, which is simply a way of hiding and concealing the violence for certain concrete lives that are being crushed. And that gives universality a bad name, because it's simply a rhetoric that hides and conceals violent attacks on concrete lives, as opposed to all lives mattering in a genuine way. And you start with those concrete lives that have been crushed violently and viciously by a system who uses a cheap universalism to justify itself. Now, in terms of American history, it's very important to keep in mind, America is a business civilization. It's a market culture. And its dominant myth has been the frontier. And the frontier is the line between the civilized and the savages. So from Davy Crockett on the ground to John Wayne on the screen, that has been a fundamental myth, the frontier myth. And you get more regeneration through violence by the expansion of civilization vis-a-vis savages. Okay. You take, for example, what happened in America in 1877. You had a massive strike of workers. You had the Sioux War against indigenous peoples. You had the withdrawal of the federal troops so that the Klan and others could take over and attack Black peoples. So all three were savages: indigenous peoples, Black peoples, workers' movements, crushed violently. So the United States has a intensely violent history vis-a-vis indigenous people, intensely violent history vis-a-vis Black people, and an intensely violent people vis-a-vis the workers' movement. Workers could not engage in collective bargaining until 1936.
Wow.
The country was founded in 1789. I mean, you had collective workers' rights in Argentina in 1836. And Argentina is not a nation known to being on the cutting edge for social justice. But it took the United States another 100 years, because you had the robber bands, because you had the Pinkerton clubs that were engaged in vicious, violent attack on any attempt of working people to come together. And patriarchal violence, domestic violence, ethnic violence against various ethnic groups fighting each other. Long history, and we haven't got to Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the only empire in the history of the world to drop bombs and kill simultaneously 100,000 people. That's a violence that's hard to even describe. That's the United States engaging in that. So that long history of violence, meaning then that it's very difficult to keep track of the universality in a genuine sense of each and every one of us. Because anytime you talk about race or class or gender or empire, you're talking about levels of barbarity and atrocity in the history of the United States. And of course, this is true for the species as a whole. Each nation has its own distinctive history of empire and class and gender and caste and so forth and so on. I mean, India has a distinctive history in terms of the ways in which the caste hierarchy becomes so intertwined with pre-modern forms of domination or feudalism, or modern forms of capitalism, or even late capitalist forms in which it looks as if the capitalism has been changed in a liberal way, and yet caste is still operating, adapting itself, and our brothers and sisters who are locked within that caste domination are oftentimes rendered invisible.
Professor West, to just bring back to this idea of reciprocity and bring this focus to kind of segue your thought. I mean, in India, the Dalit community, every 18 minutes, one Dalit is undergoing atrocity. And that kind of graph adds too much to the kind of number of, the number of Dalit bodies that were, dead. So when George Floyd protest was taking place in India, we had 8 Dalits were hacked to death. And it was, somewhere.
Wow.
And it also, and in some instances, it was recorded on the phone. And almost in irony to the justice across the world, in here also they were shot, and sometimes they were hacked, and these are the kind of gory incidents we continue to see, which doesn't ring bell in many quarters. And there is very much an acknowledgement of the there's always justification given by well-meaning people in the dominant caste positions in India. I will just like to, so the Dalit Panther, one of the founders of Dalit Panther, who is alive, Mr. Pawar, he released a letter in solidarity with the Black movement. And I will just read out one sentence, where he says, "But it is a rare event in which atrocities against Dalits from India seize the attention of people from the Western world." I think that's and this is by by the way 50 years of struggle, and this comes to our consciousness. What do you think should happen or could happen so that there is a accountability to the lost Dalit lives that are in India? Because we don't have any United Nations resolution on caste-related issues, similar to what we do in Palestine. If a life is lost, it's an attention where global media pays adequate kind of at least recognition of that. It doesn't happen in Dalit community. How would you, out of your experience, would think about creating a more understanding of this Dalit issues in India as you look at the Black issues and the worldwide oppression?
Well, I mean, one is that there has to be a kind of mutual solidarity that takes the form of voices within the U.S. empire, putting Dalit misery and resistance under a spotlight for the world. So that let's say if Brother Bernie had won, and his foreign policy team is being brought together and saying, we are going to the United Nations with a declaration having to do with the plight and predicament of Dalits. Yeah. We've already got that with the Palestinians. We've already got that with those in Kashmir, rightly so, Tibet, Kurds, right across the board. Dalits now must be part and parcel of any conversation about domination, subjugation, and degradation. So same is true with the artists. We have to have, well-known artists, hip-hop folk, who do songs about the Dalits and bring in the Dalit voices. You got some serious Dalit artists. They've got to do things together. Jay-Z got to do something with a Dalit artist. Everybody say, well, Dalit mean? Well, you got something to learn. Listen to this brother or sister. They got some serious artists, but that's a way of putting it under a spotlight so that Dalits become integral to any serious talk about struggle for freedom. And that is a real possibility because people are growing. People are expanding. The kind of work that we do with our dear sister, the Roma sister. Her name is Magna, Sister Magna. The three of us, we the three musketeers. We all three go together. You talk about these Roma, you're going to talk about Dalit. Talk about Dalit, you're going to talk about Black folk. You're going to talk about Black folk, you're going to talk about Palestinians. You're going to talk about Palestinians. You're going to talk about peasants in Brazil. You're going to talk about peasants in Brazil. You're going to talk about so it's an integral kind of thing. And that's part of what I think folks on the street are hungry for. They know they're out there not simply for the political murder of one Black brother. They know they must have a systemic analysis. Anytime they talk about systematic racism, you can't confine it to just the United States, because you can see how quickly the neoliberals were co-opted. Next thing you know, Wall Street will understand itself to being on the cutting edge of fighting against racism when it's reproducing a whole host of forms of wealth inequality and corporate greed and so forth. They just want to make things more colorful. They want to bring in some black faces and brown faces and yellow and indigenous faces and so forth. No, it's got to cut much, much deeper than that. That's so right. I welcome my brother's courageous and powerful words. And it's a challenge to those of us who are right here in the belly of this beast. Yeah. And saying, you know, there's a lot of marvelous people in the American empire of all colors who are willing to raise their voices, who are willing to fight. It's just that collectively, they're still relatively powerless when it comes to pushing for the fundamental transformation of Wall Street power, Pentagon power, police power, and the way in which the White House and Congress have been colonized by Wall Street, Pentagon, and police to be beholden to those powers rather than people's powers. And that's, I think, in the end, going to be one of the major challenges, oh brother, because in you know, the possible ecological catastrophe and the planet itself being under tremendous threat, and nuclear catastrophe with the 6 or 7 countries that have nuclear power can blow the whole thing up. And then the difficulty of conceiving of how to have a genuine fundamental transformation in an American empire that is so entrenched in terms of its greed and in terms of its contempt for peoples of color. It's a, you know, Du Bois wrestled with this and he said, cheer up, the Negro can never win in America. I must go to Ghana. I must go to the international stage, you know. Many of the great black spokesmen, as you know, the 19th century used to say, for black people in America, never confuse our situation with that of the Israelites of the Old Testament. Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Seas. Everywhere you turn, there's a new Pharaoh. And sometimes that Pharaoh is a black Pharaoh that's smiling and brilliant and witty, but still profoundly beholden to Wall Street power, Pentagon power, won't say a mumbling word about Wall Street crimes, won't say a mumbling word about drones being dropped in Yemen or Afghanistan, which is to say Pentagon crimes, won't say a mumbling word about the ways in which the black bourgeoisie at its worst, the black neoliberals are beholden to Wall Street power and crimes, Pentagon power and crimes, and think that somehow they can be on the cutting edge of a Black Lives Matter movement from above.
That's right.
That's going. It's hard to be on Pontius Pilate's payroll and say you in solidarity with a brother named Jesus.
You know, so, you know, when it comes to, when you talked about black bourgeoisie, but also within the George Floyd's incident, we also saw the white cop, but also an Asian cop fronting. And so the Asian American Commission of Massachusetts released a statement in support of Black lives, and they condemned the kind of Asian affinity of model myth minority, which basically works in your favor. You can be black when you want to, and you can switch the sides to white when white affinity grants you a certain status and certain access to resources. And within that Asian American Commission statement, there was an acknowledgement of Dalit Panthers. And it made an effect that Dalit Panther solidarity gave Asian Americans a certain footing within the black space to say that there has been a Panther solidarity within Asian framework. And I saw that quite interesting playing out, that the Dalit solidarity was taken into consideration by the Asian as a whole scope, which was a welcome call. This was the first time ever.
Wow.
Exactly.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. No, I think they need to hand out your book to all of those who signed that statement so they can get a sense of the lived experience and the genuine dignity, critique, and resistance coming out of the Dalit community, going all the way back hundreds of years, and now becoming more manifest. And of course, as you know so strongly, Dalit women.
That's right, indeed.
Very much so. Sister Tina and the others, absolutely. You are absolutely right. But what I love about your book, again, is that you've got a universalism. So you're able to acknowledge the Brahmin Indians who are in deep solidarity with Dalit movements. So you don't get into this kind of narrow identity, so-called identity politics. You're recognizing all of us have multiple identities, making moral choices, and can be either in deep solidarity with folk coming up from below, or can accommodate ourselves and be in cahoots with folk above. And so we have to keep those dimensions in mind in any talk about solidarity, so that the moral and spiritual dimensions have a primacy, not some kind of automatic ideology that makes people somehow better than somebody else simply because they were born somewhere. Everybody could choose to be a decent person, choose to be a courageous person, choose to be a visionary person, choose to look at the world through the lens of those who are suffering below, choose, in fact, to live and die for something bigger than your ego. You see, the centrality of that choice must be accented, or we get locked in and we get divided and then get conquered by the powers that be.
Professor West, just a final question before I invite Prateeti to ask her set of questions. When you were saying about this cross-border solidarity with the Dalit, Black, and Roma people, especially in the context of Dalit Black, there's already been a template. It is not that we have to reinvent a new wheel. All it takes is to sort of, oil the machine and bring it on the road for it to work. One of the things I was thinking is, how about considering having a Dalit Black cultural exchange program where the youngsters as well as the church leaders, because church has played a prominent role in India, because even MLK, when he went, the Quaker Club and other church members were quite invested in Dr. King when he was touring with his spouse to India. If one has to really concretize, because many people would want to know, how then would you like to escalate? Because I don't think before my generation, Professor, anybody would even come and talk to you or sit with you. Or when I say you, I also mean as a representation of a Black tradition of intellectualism in Black space, Black activism. So this is a new kind of forging of ties. And if I have to graduate this to a next level, there has to be some plan which is action oriented, where like Palestinian trips, many African-American activists go and undertake. How would you think about such plans, or do you have any kind of pointed suggestions for people who are listening to kind of take back home and think about it?
No, I think that people who do have resources should try to set up institutions and infrastructures that would facilitate the travel of Dalit brothers and sisters to Black communities to Dalit brothers and sisters, intellectuals, artists, working people, and people who just living in the world. To consolidate those kinds of connections become very important, because I think we do have to acknowledge that even though the great Du Bois and the great Bettger had the correspondence that they did, I mean, they were such pioneers. I mean, we don't have a language for those two brothers. We really don't. They're so far ahead of their time. So far ahead of their time.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in the 60s, in a way, we missed it. You see, in the 60s, it became Martin King and Gandhi. And as much as we appreciate Gandhi, we're going to have to demote that brother, which is not eliminate, because he's got some spiritual truths that are important, but we got to demote him because he missed it when it comes to the elimination, the abolition of caste, the dismantling of caste. But that also means that Martin missed it. As much as we love Martin, that he missed it because his alliance with Gandhi still led toward rendering invisible the plight of Dalit brothers and sisters. Malcolm didn't accent it. Stokely and the others didn't accent as much as they should. So that we actually have something missing. We got a hole in our movements in terms of the Black folk here missing it. Now, the Dalit Panthers didn't miss it.
Mhm.
The Dalit Panthers picked up on Huey, picked up on Erica Huggins, picked up on Bobby Seale, you
That's
see.
right.
But we didn't have folk in the States who's picking up on the Dalit plight in the way that we are. This time around, at this particular moment, and this is the biggest moment of reckoning and awakening the United States has had since 1960. That's a long time. That's 60 years ago. You see, that's a long time. We've got to make sure we don't miss it.
That's right.
And one of the ways you do that is to ensure that people are able to spend time together in contact. Just like me and you. I mean, you know, all the times we kick it together, man, reflect on things. You know, it's not just political exchange. We reveling in each other's humanity. You know what I mean? I'm concerned about how your mama's doing, and you're concerned about how my mama's doing. And that kind of level of engagement means that you become genuine brothers or sisters or comrades, not just in a political and ideological way, but in a moral and a spiritual way too. That's what I think is required, but that is increasing, thank God.
No, it is indeed. I think, you know, and in my next book, I'm kind of exploring what MLK and how did he miss the.
Ooh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
And there is an archive of that kind of helps us to take a cue and so Sister Angela Davis, she was in India 3 years ago, and she had shared a stage with the founder of the Dalit Panther, and she had acknowledged as someone, she said the profound misreading, that's what the word she used, by MLK and the Black leadership to understand the Dalit humanity and the Dalit plight. And she just kind of uplifted the voice of trying to come and trying to correct that. And that was a very spiritual moment for someone like me and many people like me who saw that recognition and acknowledgement, and also in a very positive candor to say there were certain mistakes done, but let that not hold us back, but let's now move on to a next stage. Um, uh, the white people in America are in solidarity with Black people, whatever we see. We don't see that happening with India, the dominant caste, the Brahmins and other castes, standing for the Dalit rights. There are very minuscule few, which I wholly acknowledge. What happened? Do you have anything or a message to the Brahmins or the other dominant caste out of your struggle to tell them why it is important for them to participate in a struggle of human liberation of the people who are most oppressed and remain at the altar of destruction?
Wow, that's a deep question. I don't really have an adequate answer to that question. I really don't. I would have to know much more history of the various regions in India. I'd have to know much more history of the ways in which the Brahmin Marxists and the Brahmin leftists, who would be in some ways some of the primary candidates, how they missed a caste analysis when they had a class analysis, or how they missed being able to keep track of the distinctiveness of the Dalit plight, even as they were deeply concerned about working class people and poor people. We'd have to really look at that history and see those silences and those blind spots, because India has a very rich history of Marxists, very rich history of leftists, very much so. And there's, you know, I'm sure there's a significant slice of Brahmin brothers and sisters who have been in solidarity with Dalits, but still not that highly visible. You see, the United States, you know, we got John Brown. John Brown said, "You're gonna have a civil war where blood flows." He was as white as the stereotypical Norwegian, but he's willing to die for Black people and his sons. And then boom, a few years later, he got a civil war. So you can't, it's impossible to push out John Brown from the public imagination of the nation.
That's right.
Because the Civil War was so central in the shaping of the nations. You know, the most barbaric of 19th century affairs, and you had many other barbaric affairs with indigenous peoples even before and after. So that I would have to know much more about the history of India to really try to understand the Brahmin Dalit connection, the Brahmin Marxist Dalit struggle, the Brahmin leftists, the Brahmin prophetic Christians, prophetic whatever religion you're talking about. You got Hindus, that raises a deep question. Well, can you be a prophetic Hindu without subscribing to any notion of caste? What would be left? Because Hindus have produced some magnificent spiritualists, but what would be left if you gave up on caste, given the way in which caste has been so intricately connected to Hinduism? That's a very important question. And I don't purport to have an answer to it. But I've known some wonderful Hindu brothers and sisters who are anti-caste. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of what form they would really take institutionally, and what would that do to the history of Hinduism if you actually tried to extricate the caste dimensions? Those are very tough questions, and they will be answered and wrestled with by powerful thinkers, including disproportionately Indian thinkers of all the various groups.
Indeed. Thank you so much for this, Professor. I think your class begins with the existential question of death. And as the students, after the class, we would spend hours discussing and debating the importance of death, the importance of perishing. And you so soulfully put it as if it's something one needs to carry with pride and not to, and even your life story replicates that. And I think this is a very deep spiritual question for us to hold on to, as to what will death mean for people if you're constantly in the process of oppressing others or harassing others. And I think on that, let me invite Prateeti to please offer your set of questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor West and Suraj. Your vast and expansive long history of violence and structures of domination and greed. I think you've tracked that along with Professor West's characteristic generosity of spirit, characterizing human beings for their sanctity, dignity, preciousness. I think this was so breathtaking that I think you have answered most of my questions, most of the questions our members asked, but I will still try and address some of them. Are there, one of the questions the international connections that you emphasized, are there any learnings across geographies? I was speaking to Dr. John Bracey the other day, and he was saying, why are there not, he taught a course called Blacks and Dalits this semester, and he was asking, why are there not enough equivalents of the historically Black colleges, such as Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse, in Dalit institutions in India? And you also referred to institution building. Could you address that, these learnings across geographies?
Thank you again for your kind and generous words, and I appreciate your powerful question, especially the great John Bracey. It's good to know that he's still strong as ever. He's one of the great figures emerging out of SNCC and been a distinguished professor there at UMass Amherst.
Yes,
he's still there, right?
Yes, I don't think they'll let him retire. They keep calling him back. He's retired, but they keep calling him back.
No, that's nice. No, I think that part of it has to do with the fact that, again, it was the Civil War that made Americans of all colors recognize that race and white supremacy could ring down the curtain on the American experiment as they knew it. And so you had a number of New England liberal white brothers and sisters who right after the war said the first thing we must do is to provide a network of universities to ensure the spreading of literacy and education for Black people, so that most of the great Black institutions like Howard University and Morehouse and Spelman and so forth, it was 110 of them, that most of them, if not nearly all of them, resulted from white liberal money, white liberal teachers white liberal professors, and up until the 1920s, they had mainly white liberal presidents of those black institutions. And so the question would be, why was there not a similar parallel of Brahmins who looked on Dalit brothers and sisters as locked in a predicament and plight, who required massive education, massive college and university presence within the Dalit community, with the Brahmins themselves providing leadership for a good while. So that the histories of these two countries becomes a very fascinating comparative analysis regarding something like black colleges, black institutions. And as one could imagine, you know, when you have white liberals who themselves are building the university, like Spelman College, which is the finest college for black women, as you know, comes from the Rockefellers. And Spelman was a Rockefeller, see. Or Fisk University, which was tied very much to the Congregationalists and was tied very much to white liberal philanthropy. Tuskegee was very different with Booker T. Washington. He had black professors, he had a black president, but he primarily had money from Andrew Carnegie, Robert Barron. You see. So that the analysis, the comparative analysis that we'd have to have would lead us to contrast the ways in which the resources coming from above did slowly trickle down into these black colleges and universities, and where was the trickling for Brahmins vis-a-vis Dalits in India? Why did it not take place? What are the conditions under which it may have partly taken place? Those are the kinds of questions I think we'd have to raise.
We have one member who asks a question. Do you think having a black president made a difference at all? You had discussions and differences with President Barack Obama. Could you speak about them?
I think that anytime you have a breakthrough of any sort, which is an indictment of a form of domination, it's a positive thing. And so to have a black president and a White House built by black people, it was positive in terms of self-confidence. It was positive in terms of what symbols do. Symbols do matter. And to have a black president, very much like having the first black heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson, or the first black X or Y, that's a symbolic indictment of white supremacy. That's a positive thing. The first woman, very positive. You know, male supremacy needs indictment of any sort. It can be symbolic or it could be substantial. Now the question then becomes, once that president, that black president is a symbolic indictment and gains access, what do they do? What do they do? And this is where I was very critical of Barack Obama, because it was not just his beholden to Wall Street and bailing Wall Street out. It was not just his beholden to the Pentagon, allowing torturers to get off with no accountability whatsoever, very much like these policemen who kill folk who get off with no accountability whatsoever. It was not just the drones that it dropped, but it was also the fact that for the first 6.5 years, he would say over and over again to black people, I am not president of Black America, I'm president of all America. I'm not your president, I'm everybody's president. There's nothing special about you. What I do for everybody, I do for you. So he denied a black agenda. He denied the specific features of the black situation. And that was such a slap in the face when 98% of the black folk voted for him. And yet when he went to Catholics, when he went to Jews, when he went to Wall Street, he said, I'm your president. So he thought that just by being black, that in and of itself was the major achievement. Whereas the being black is a achievement, but the grand achievement is what you do when you get in that office with power and bend it toward the least of these, the poor, working classes, and especially the black and poor working classes. That's what he did not do. That's why black child poverty went up. That's why wealth inequality went up. and he ends up with just this symbolic status. And now, of course, this is what we're seeing in this particular moment. I call it the Wizard of Oz moment. You might remember in that wonderful movie where Toto removes that curtain and you discover who Wizard of Oz really is. You thought he had such authority. You thought he had such power. And it's just this person out here with these machinations and various strategies of trying to convince these people he does, but there's no there there. We're looking for substance. So you can't be a black president and don't say a word about the new Jim Crow or mass incarceration until your 7th year in power. How can that be? That's one of the most vicious forms of American life. Disproportionately black and brown. You can't say a word about it because you think that somehow it's going to unravel and unsettle your white population of this and that. No, take a stand based on what you think is right. That's what I mean by him not having the kind of spine that I would have liked to have. But one can never take away the symbolic achievement of it. I was glad to support him. I just told him from the very beginning, I want to know, what is your relation to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer? And they were not looking just for symbolic representation. They were critical of the black mayors of their own day when those mayors did not prioritize the plight of poor and working people. They weren't satisfied with just black representation in high places. They wanted black representation in high places that was always in solidarity with the folk catching hell of whatever color, but disproportionately black and brown and indigenous peoples. So that's part of my own critique and indictment of my dear brother Barack Obama, but I'm in deep solidarity with him in terms of his indictment of white supremacy as the first black president, the head of the American empire, that sends a signal to people all around the world, but especially people of color. Lo and behold, you can do what you want. You ought to have confidence in yourself. You ought to respect yourself. But when you do that, don't imitate his spinelessness. When you do that, you become part of the legacy of Martin King. That's the choice you ought to make, you see. So that the symbolic representation has substance to it of a moral, spiritual, and political sort.
There was a question about immigrants. I think you addressed it somewhat, but perhaps you would want to add to this. This person says, immigrants, including Indians like ourselves, tend not to understand the history of African Americans in the United States. For instance, on campuses, the Asian model minority stereotype is often used against Black students. What is it that is distinctly different between being born African American in the USA and coming there as an immigrant?
And yet, I think, again, we tried to touch on it a bit, but we can even zero in on something a bit different. Look at the difference between being a beautifully Black immigrant from Ethiopia and a beautifully Black person like myself, 10th generation. Even within the Black community, the voluntary immigration has a different status, different set of dynamics than being enslaved, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, discriminated, lynched, and what have you. So then when you add the Asians, Indians, various sorts, whatever class or whatever region or what have you, you see, voluntary too, coming to the United States with this history. United States is an empire with tremendous opportunities. It's a place where you're able to engage in upward mobility of a certain sort. That is significant. That's not to be downplayed. But all of that itself is parasitic on and has been dependent on a racial hierarchy. It's not the same as caste in India, but it has caste-like features. And Oliver C. Cox, in his book on race, caste, and class, tries to tease out these differences and similarities. So given all these opportunities, that racial hierarchy has still been in place. And so when an immigrant says, I am an American citizen, George Washington is one of my founding fathers, Fine. That means that you got a relation to a slaveholder, that you become a beneficiary of a slave-based system in the founding of the nation of those who are cast now as your founding father. And that's not solely negative, because George Washington was also a very violent urban guerrilla fighter. You know, he fought a very ugly war against the British Empire, and he won. I'm glad he won. But he was an anti-imperialist fighter. Ran a militia. Won 3 out of 9 battles, the right battles he won. And that anti-imperialist element is part of our history too. That's something positive to me. But the negative side has to do with this. Ooh, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all of these slave holders. Ooh, that's barbaric. And then the history of that as it moves into Jim Crow, Jane Crow, then the new Jim Crow presently, and now the discriminatory practices still too often operating, though in no way identical with the slavery, in no way identical with the old Jim Crow, but still unacceptable because it's losing sight of the humanity of people. That kind of history, every voluntary immigrant from Asia or any other place has to come to terms with when they enter the United States and say, now, this is the country I'm a part of. There's a lot of good stuff here. There's a lot of bad stuff here. There's some magnificent things going on in the country, and there's some ugly things going on. And you have to be able to keep track of both.
Thank you. This person asks, in your work, you have drawn on the wisdom of diverse traditions from Greek philosophy to the blues. Could you tell us about some of the sources of your inspiration and how they might address current needs?
Well, for me, I'm trying to mobilize any and every form of insight, wisdom, any form of spiritual, intellectual weaponry in order to try to keep a moral and spiritual high ground and try to leave the world a little better than I found it. So in growing up on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, I've got the most magnificent family in the world, Mom and Dad and Cynthia and Cheryl and Clifton, and then my son Clifton and my daughter Zaytun and so on, that they help sustain me. My Shiloh Baptist Church is a fundamental part of who I am. Going to Harvard and Princeton, I learned so much from a variety of different teachers of different colors, from John Rawls to Hillary Putnam to Stanley Cavell to Sheldon Wolin to Richard Rorty. I can go on and on. I was blessed by them, and I have to be true to what I am, which means I'm always going to have limitations. I'm always going to have my own blind spots and faults and foibles, but I've got some rich stuff that I've been given, and I try to recast it in my own way in order to give it to others. And so philosophically speaking, for example, I'm still very much a part of the Western philosophical tradition. The Socrates means much to me. That restlessness and intense questioning and scrutinizing and calling things into question and teasing out assumptions and presuppositions, very Socratic, that means much to me. Similarly, so my own prophetic Christianity and the legacy of Jerusalem, of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, this notion of Hesed, this loving kindness being spread to the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless. To be human is to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. That's very much a part of who I am. And so my whole conception of what it means to be human, as both a Black man, as both someone in the US empire, open to a variety of different traditions, but in some ways disproportionately shaped by the Socratic legacy of Athens, the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, the Enlightenment legacies that come out of the best of Europe, and the deep artistic creativity and compassion that come out of my own Black tradition. I don't think it's hard to find a people who for 400 years has been so chronically hated and still dish out such love warriors like Martin Luther King Jr., John Coltrane's Love Supreme. James Baldwin. It's hard, and I don't want to engage in a comparative analysis too much, but that's my tradition. And I intend to be true to the best of that tradition, but always listening and learning what indigenous peoples have to say, and what all of the rich nations and cultures of Africa have to say, and what the Asian traditions have to say, and what the secular traditions and the scientific traditions, a variety of different countries have to say. But in the end, I have to come down in regard to who I am, which is my mama's child, my daddy's kid.
We have another autobiographical question, since we're on that track. For our viewers in India, could you tell us about your engagement in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, your personal engagement? There were real gains, were there not?
Oh, indeed, indeed. See, I was 14 years old when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, when he was assassinated in Memphis. I worked very closely with the Black Panther Party. Couldn't join the party because they had secular atheistic preconditions, and as a Christian, there was no way that I was going to give up on Jesus in order to be part of a political movement. But I worked very closely with them, their breakfast programs and their prison programs, because we had strong overlap, and I liked a lot of their class analysis and their critiques of empire, but I remained a revolutionary Christian up until this very moment. So I came late. That civil rights movement by the late 60s was really transforming into a Black Power movement, transforming into a much more revolutionary movement with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Black Panthers and what have you. So I came on that second wave, as it were. There was no doubt that the civil rights movement had tremendous breakthroughs. There were magnificent concessions that the ruling class had to make, but those were primarily confined to the Black middle class. It didn't spill down to the Black poor. It didn't spill down to the Black working class that was devastated by deindustrialization, the withdrawal of industrial production units to various parts of the world, the ways in which affirmative action was operating, but it operated primarily among those students who were on their way to college. See, only 1 out of 3 Americans go to college, and only 1 out of 4 Black Americans go to college. So you got 75% of my Black brothers and sisters who didn't in any way benefit from affirmative action as it related to higher education. So it's very much a Black bourgeois affair, and the Black bourgeoisie expanded as the Black poor expanded, tied to the mass incarceration regime, tied to the prison system, and devastated in terms of their jobs being taken away, high levels of underemployment and unemployment, you see. So I primarily tried to keep my focus for the last 40 years on the Black poor and the Black working class, and it pit me against the Black middle class for the most part, not because I hate them. I'm a member of the Black middle class in terms of a professor at Harvard, and Harvard is a ruling class institution in terms of its ties to the elite in the US empire. But my heart, mind, soul, energy, focus has tried to be what my Bible tells me, which is keep track of the least of these. What you do unto me, what you do unto the poor, the prisoner, the worker, the abused woman, the persecuted, the oppressed, the exploited. That is a moral and spiritual lure, a commandment that I take very seriously, you see. So I've always had to be in the world, but not of the world. I've always tried to bear witness to something bigger than me. See, I was told as a child, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And the question becomes, what kind of heaven are you leaving behind in a hellish, nightmarish world? And that's an insight open to everybody. But each person has to answer that in the dark corners of their own soul, and then try to live it and be willing to die.
So maybe we'll make this our last question. Since you've been quoting from the Old Testament, could you speak a bit to the history of African Americans in relation to other communities in the United States such as the Jewish community. You wrote a book on the subject called Blacks and Jews. What are some of the issues that separate the communities and bring them together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been blessed to work with a number of magnificent Jewish brothers and sisters last 45 years or so. You've always had a disproportionate of Jewish brothers and sisters in the United States who are willing to be in solidarity with poor and working people. We know that Jews for 2,000 years have been a hated people. They've been a hunted people. And for the most part, they have been underdogs. Now, what makes the last 50 years distinctive is that you've got significant numbers of Jews who no longer are underdogs, but are middle dogs, top dogs, and some of them top dogs. So that the anti-Jewish hatred that has been so much a part of Western civilization and Christian civilizations as well, and to some degree Muslim civilizations, it reinforces an underdog mentality among Jewish brothers and sisters, even when they're top dogs in regard to certain situations of power. So that in the United States, for example, Jews, when they first arrived, they were treated in very ugly ways, with discrimination and quotas and Ivy Leagues and so forth and so on. As a result of putting literacy, reading texts, commentary on biblical works at the center of one's culture, they had high levels of literacy. So once the anti-Jewish barriers were burst, you got large numbers of Jews who had access to education, the education translated into jobs, the jobs translated into power and wealth. And so now you've got significant number of Jewish brothers and sisters who have significant income, significant wealth, high levels of education. The Ivy League schools themselves, 20, 25% Jews. Jews are only 1.8% of the population. And rightly so, they worked hard to gain access to it, but it's hard after a while to still view yourself as underdog when you've got top dogs in Congress, top dogs on Wall Street, top dogs in corporate America, top dogs in the media, top dogs across the board. Now you still got working class Jews, you still have poor Jews, but a disproportionate amount of Jews now are upper middle class and above. So you look at their history and you say, you were told in the Hebrew scripture, remember when you were in Egypt. Remember I told you to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with their God. I didn't tell you just to make it. I didn't tell you to gain access to big amount of money and turn your back on working people. So you end up now with what, 30-some% of Jews voted for Trump. Now that to me is a major contrast with Hebrew scripture. Major. And you got towering Jewish prophets like Susanna Heschel, who say exactly what I'm saying right now. Of course, she's the daughter of the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So you still have a number of prophetic and strong progressive Jewish brothers and sisters. But the same would be true with Israel. You see, Israel begins as an underdog. They jump out of the burning buildings of Europe upon a land, but somebody else is there. There's not a land with no people. Somebody's there. And so you have to either coexist or you have to dominate. Albert Einstein said coexist. Jabotinsky said dominate. Netanyahu comes out of the legacy of Jabotinsky. Dominate those others, dominate those Arabs, dominate those Palestinians, subjugate them. Einstein said coexist, create a binational democracy. Einstein was not listened to in that regard, you see. And so what has happened in the last 40 years or so is that you've got a major realignment of significant numbers, not a majority, but significant numbers of Jewish brothers and sisters in the American empire who are either with Trump, neo-fascists, or very much with the neoliberals in the Democratic Party, but won't say a mumbling word when it comes to the plight of Palestinian brothers and sisters. Won't say a mumbling word when it comes to Wall Street domination of a serious sort. Now you've got Noam Chomsky and others, also Jewish, who was critical of the whole shebang. And Noam and I are very, very close, even though he's agnostic, he's secular, he's an anarchist or a certain kind of socialist anarchist, whereas I am a revolutionary Christian and a kind of, I don't know what kind of ism would fit, but I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. So that this relation between blacks and Jews has become frayed. We have wonderful relations with the Noam Chomsky's, Naomi Klein's, and others. We have some relation with some of the neoliberal Jewish folk, hardly any relations with the right-wing Jewish folk. And see, when you have almost 30% of your population for Trump, then you say, see, we had about 2% for Trump. So you can see the difference in terms of the communities as a whole. And yet you want to stay in contact with the humanity of each and every one of the Black or Jewish folk, whether you agree with them or not. But that's just the beginnings of a complicated story of Black and Jewish relations in the States.
Thank you. I'm afraid we might have tired you out, but thank you so much, Professor West and Dr. Suraj Yengde, for this rich and wide-ranging conversation. I have certainly learned a great deal, and we hope that your insights help to muster the vision, courage, and will to bring about change in the United States and in India and all over the world. So thanks to our audiences as well for watching, and hope you will join us for our next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I salute both of you. Absolutely.
Thank you.